right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome back to another episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don Pizzette, back again with Mr. Ronnie Wong. How's it going, Ronnie?
It is going well today. We had our first pad phone announcement yesterday, and we still don't know when it's coming out, so I'm doing okay.
For the viewers that have been with us long enough, I think most people probably know that I am obsessed with this pad phone device. I must have it. And they're obviously exercising the greatest in project management skills because they have announced zero date data. It's really frustrating, but that's all right. So anyhow, today we are going to take a look at risk. So for example, I have a great level of risk of being disappointed when the pad phone never comes out. But but yeah, so we're going to take a look at risk. Every project has risk, has this possibility that certain events can happen, and part of being a good project manager is planning for that and being prepared and being able to handle that if a certain event were to occur. All right, so we're going to take a look at that. We got a whole process group for it. Let's jump into our PMBOK here. So I'm going back into my process group chart here and my knowledge areas, and we've moved through a lot of planning at this point. We're kind of getting down to the last part. This is the last of the large sections. In fact, if you look at everything after this is really the last of the large sections for the whole process group arrangement. But you'll see for plan risk, we've actually got 5 different processes available. There's a lot, right? A lot of stuff here. There are many people out there who make a perfectly good living as risk managers. This is an entire career field. There is a science. You can get masters and PhDs in risk management. And it's because it's so complex. There's so much theory, there's so much there that it's really an impressive world. For us as a project manager, we're just dipping our toe in it, right? We're just getting a little bit into that world of risk and not being exposed to the whole craziness of it. But that doesn't mean we can't be familiar with it, right? We need to, at least at a high level, be able to plan for that risk, figure out what's going on, and set up reasonable expectations. If we can't, we need to hire somebody, bring in a consultant, bring in somebody who's a risk manager to be able to evaluate that for us. All right, so the first process group, just like everything else, is coming up with a plan, right? So plan for risk management. We need to come up with our risk management plan. Our company might already have one. If they do, we're done, right? If they don't, though, we can skip over this, go through the 4 other processes as we plan for risk, and then take whatever we found worked for us and turn that in to our risk management plan. All right. But let's take a look at that plan risk management process anyway, because sooner or later you have to go through it. And this is it right here. So we start off by taking our inputs, and our main inputs here are going to be the project charter and the stakeholder register. Those 2 things, because the project charter is saying what we're planning on doing, and the stakeholder register, which is saying who's involved, because that's usually where our risk is going to come from, what we're trying to do and who's got their hands in it. So we need those. Depending on where you're at in your project, if you started this right after initiation, which plenty of people do, then those may be the only documents you have. But if you've already gone through some of your planning cycles, if you've already created your schedule and your budget, then there's new risks that come in, and so those may serve as inputs here also. But assuming that we start this right after initiation, then those 2 documents are pretty much all we have. You may have your project management plan. Again, if your company's been doing formal project management, you'll have that. And then our enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets that we've seen in darn near every single process. All right, so nothing new and shocking there. All documents that we've already got prepared. What we do now is we figure out how we're going to handle risk for our particular project, right? And there's a few different things that we need to choose from, the main thing being the analytical techniques. Now, I don't want to dive too deep into the analytical techniques right now, because we've got a few that we'll see. But that's because we're going to really see them when we start talking about identifying risks, qualitative analysis, quantitative analysis. So we got a lot of tools available. So when we create our risk management plan, what we're doing is saying which analytical techniques work best for our company. And if we pick certain techniques, how do we use them? How do we use them for managing risk? Remember, these plans, whenever you see that word plan in our little title there, that means that we're trying to create something generic that can apply to more than one project so that it can be reused. We're also going to use our expert judgment, and we're going to have meetings to come up with what's acceptable with us and our management, our upper executives, and so on, and come up with something that works well for the organization. And when we're done, we generate our risk management plan. And let me bring up my template for that, which apparently I am not in, so let me get into that. But I've got a template for a risk management plan, which is in here somewhere. And
yep, you were right there. Second,
did I
risk
skip
management
over?
plan to the left and down.
Is this not alphabetized? What is
It doesn't
going
look
on?
like it.
Hang on. See, this is the problem.
Oh,
with
there you go.
alphabets. There we go. Risk management plan. So apparently in icon view, they don't bother alphabetizing for me. All right, so here's my risk management plan. So we're going to have things in here like our methodology. What methodology do we follow when it comes to managing risk? And we're going to talk about some of those methodologies later. We just haven't seen them yet as far as whether we're going to be proactive or reactive in some of the different responses that we have. What roles and responsibilities? Who is it that's in charge of risk? And your company might have a risk management department, and so they'll have a big role and responsibility there, or it might be all up to you as the project manager, and that's very common in small companies. We have our risk categories. As we start to break down our risks, how do we do that? How do we categorize them to determine how we're going to handle them? Where does the risk management funding come from? This is important. In some organizations, the risk management funding has to come from the project budget itself. But in other organizations, there may be a central pool of funds available for risk management across all of the projects. You see that in program environments a good bit. You also have areas where maybe your company is bonded, so it's got an insurance policy of its own that applies to risks even inside of your project. So that risk management funding might not come from within the project itself, it might come from without. Contingency protocols, right? If we set up things like cash reserves and schedule reserves, what is the contingency? What are the rules for us going and accessing those reserves? Frequency and timing. This one's a little confusing. It's talking about how often do we need to monitor for the risks. So, for example, if we're doing an outdoor rock concert and I know that it might rain, and so I set up a contingency plan for that. Well, how often do I need to check the weather to see whether it's going to rain? Because 3 months before the event, it's really hard to predict that weather, right? 1 month from the event, it's really hard to predict that weather. 2 weeks from the event, you start getting more accurate details. 1 week from the event, even more accurate. 3 days before, 2 days, 1 day, the closer you get to the event, the more accurate it becomes. And so we may need to designate here what is the frequency and timing that we're going to use as far as monitoring and keeping up with that to ensure that we have the most up-to-date information possible. Looking 3 months ahead, I might say there's a 20% chance of rain.
Yeah.
But 1 week ahead, I might look at it and say, ooh, that's like a 60% chance, right? So that's the kind of thing that we need to keep tracks of. All right, stakeholder risk tolerances. I know we talked about this in episode 1 or 2, right? It was very early on in the PMP show that we started with this. Your stakeholders, and not just your key, like your sponsor, but your just general stakeholders, fall into one of 3 risk categories. You have people who are risk averse, who don't want to take risks. You have people that are risk seekers, people who are looking for risk because they know the bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. And then you have people who are risk neutral, people who aren't averse to taking a risk if the odds are good enough that they're going to succeed. They'll weigh the numbers, they'll look at it and make an informed decision. We hope that everybody is risk neutral, but that's not always the case. And then you see these great success stories of people who are risk seekers, and they kind of gloss over all the failures that happen from other risk seekers. So we may need to document that, each of our stakeholders, what their tolerances are, and so how we need to handle it. Tracking and auditing, right? As we monitor these risks, how do we track that? How do we record it? How do we have that information together? What templates or forms do we use? What's our accepted method of collecting and reporting that data? Next comes our definitions. When we start to categorize our risks, when we start to compare them, we need to apply some terminology. Terminology is up to us. You can use whatever you want. Here they're showing very high, high, medium, low, very low, right? Well, what do I mean when I say there's a very low probability? Okay? Do I mean there's a less than 10% chance? Do I mean that there's a less than 50% chance? What to me is very low? We need to define that, and it needs to be numerical. It needs to be something we can measure against. It needs to be a percentage or a ratio, right? A 5-to-1 odds or something like that. We need a number we can work with. That's really important. And that's the magic of being a risk manager. That's where they're so successful is how do you put a number on some things? How do you put a number on customer happiness? I want to have it where I have a support line where people call it, and I want to make sure that my customers are happy. Okay, how do we measure that? How do we put a number on happiness? Well, we can create surveys and scales and things like that, but it is really challenging. Doctors deal with this. I don't know, Ronnie, if you've ever been to the doctor and you say, boy, my arm hurts. And they say, all right, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad does it hurt?
Yeah.
Right? Well, how do you quantify that pain, right? It's challenging. So we need to make sure that we account for that somehow, and we do that kind of stuff right here. Anytime we can assign a number, we need to do that. That's what risk managers do.
Right.
All right, we also need to take a look at the impact. We're going to talk about probability and impact quite a bit, and the impact can vary based on what it affects. Quality, time, cost, and so we go through and we say for very high, medium, very low, whatever, what their impact would be. So for example, something that is a very high impact at the scope level might not be, well, it probably would be a big deal, but if it was early enough in the project, it might not be a very big deal at all, versus something that's a very high risk to my time might be catastrophic. I have a deadline I've got to hit. If this risk occurs, I won't hit my deadline, right? That would be catastrophic. So we need to kind of define what that impact is going to be like for each objective that could be affected. All right, so those are some of the things that are going into our risk management plan. And again, we're trying to keep this somewhat generic so that we can reuse it on our other projects and be consistent. All right, so that's our first process, pretty straightforward, right? Nothing too crazy there. The real work starts with the other guys, identifying the risks, so just coming up with a list, right? And then figuring out which risks we need to deal with, and once we figure that out, how we're going to deal with them. So those are kind of the 3 steps. Now I group these two, quantitative and qualitative, I group them together, but PMI calls them out separately because it is different math. All right, so let's dive into identify risks. With identify risks, we're just trying to come up with a list of all of the risks that affect our project. And you'll see as an input, it's pretty much everything. It's pretty much everything. When it comes to risk analysis, the more data you have, the better off you'll be, right? The more informed your decisions. But before I dive into those, let me just start with one concept I want to make sure you guys understand. The term risk is really misunderstood, all right? When people hear the word risk, they think negative things, right? They think all the bad things that could happen, risk of injury, right? Risk of bankruptcy, risk of lawsuits and litigation. That's what people think of when they think risk. But there's good risks also, right? There's a risk that I own some stock and the stock value skyrockets, all right? There's a risk that my lottery ticket might be the winner, right? There's a risk that I might have millions of dollars tomorrow and have to deal with that, right? Oh, the burden of having millions of dollars. So those are real risks. So that term risk, it can be good as well as bad. And so a lot of organizations don't like to use the word risk. Instead, they like to use 2 terms, threats and opportunities, okay? A threat is a risk that if it happened would hurt the company or hurt your project. An opportunity is a risk that if it happened would help your company or help your project, right? And so when we deal with risks, we need to plan for both sides. Plan for the good as well as the bad. Because when you have a bad risk, you want to mitigate it, minimize it, reduce the impact of that threat. But when you have an opportunity, you want to exploit it. You want to take advantage. You want to make it as big as possible, right? So very different reactions based on that, but it all falls under risk. And for somebody who's not a risk manager, it's easy to lose sight of that. So when we look at all this stuff here on the left side, right, we kind of start with our constraints, right? So here's our project constraints, our scope, cost, and time, or requirements, budget, and schedule. These guys right here, if any one of these gets messed up, it affects the other two. I know that's been our ongoing theme throughout the project. I keep bringing this slide up because if we're running behind schedule, in order to get caught back up, we're either going to need to kill off some requirements or get some more money, right? All three of these are tied to each other. So when we go to identify the risks, we need to look at our cost, our schedule, and our quality, right? Those three things, that's where our risk really comes from. And here they're talking about the plans. How do we plan our cost? How do we plan our schedule? How do we plan our quality? Because they're going to include in there how we can change our cost, how we can change our schedule, and so on. And then you'll see down here the actual fixed numbers, the scope baseline, that's our requirements, right? Or our quality. Our activity cost estimates, there's our budget. Our activity duration estimates, there's our schedule, right? So those 6 entries of this 13, half the list, is really just talking about our triple constraints, right? The triumvirate of project management power. Sounds so much more fancy when you put it that way. So that really accounts for half this list. The other half are just areas where problems can creep up. Your stakeholder register, your general project documents. I love this one, right? Number 10, project documents, because that just means everything, right? all of our documentation, which really includes all these things up here. So they could have made this a lot shorter. But they want to make sure that you see all these individual entities, right? We got our procurement documents. That would be any contract, right? Because there's always a risk of breach of contract, and we're going to talk about that in the procurement knowledge area later. But there's always that risk of breach of contract. So all of these things are data that we gather together. And then we do our risk analysis. We look at all this data and we try and find anywhere where something could go wrong or where anything could exceed expectations, right? In an earlier episode, we talked about doing like beta
distribution.
Beta distributions and triangular distributions, and we talked about when we get a quote or an estimate, we do a optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely. So we're normally planning around the most likely, but our risk is documented right there. Our opportunity, our positive risk, is that most optimistic quote. Our threat, our negative risk, that is the pessimistic, right? The worst case scenario. The most likely is what we act on. So we kind of already have that idea of where our risk is there in something occurring based on those quotes that we got as far as cost and duration. So we're just going back and gathering that data again, and now we're going to make use of it, right? So we pull all that data from here. We go through, we identify everything, including our stakeholders and risks that can come from them. I've got a number of stories on this. I've dealt with people that I knew for a fact changed their minds a lot, right? If you have a project sponsor with bottomless pockets, right? With a bottomless wallet, I guess would be the better way of putting it. If you have a sponsor that has a ton of money and isn't worried about money, then they are very likely to change requirements as you go. And if you say, ooh, yeah, we can do that, but it's going to cost more, they go, fine, do it. I'm cool with that, right? Your project's going to be tough because you know early on that there's going to be constant change throughout this project because they don't have a limit of money. It seems like a good problem to have, but it is frustrating as hell because it's hard to plan around that. So that is a thing that we would need to identify in our stakeholder register. Other things we need to look at are areas where we might have people who can't make decisions. Now I've bumped into this where you have a sponsor and you throw a question to them like, hey, we're thinking about making this modification in order to facilitate this deadline. What do you think? And they go, well, let me think about it, right? Let me go back and look at some paperwork. And then a day goes by, 2 days go by, I just haven't made up my mind. 3 days goes by, 4 days goes by, right? And a decision hasn't been made. That's a real challenge, okay? I have something that my grandfather taught me. He said, I'm going to like old pointless stories now, but he had this saying. He said, when you're working on something, you got to make decisions. Make a decision. Don't delay. If you delay, that in itself is making a decision. You're choosing to do nothing, all right? And you're probably setting yourself up for failure. But he said, if you make a decision now and it's wrong, you'll probably have time to fix it. But at least you made a decision, you move forward. If you make a decision and it's right, you've set yourself up for success. You made the right decision, you move forward, right? But it all starts with making a decision and knowing that sometimes we're going to be wrong, right? You can't make the right decision every time. Otherwise, everyone would be insanely successful, and that's not the case. So we got to make a decision. If you've got a stakeholder who is notorious for not making decisions, you got to stay on top of them. When they say, I need to think about it, you say, all right, what information do you need to make a decision? Let me help you get that information. You tell me what you want. What format do you want this data in? Do you like pie charts? I can make pie charts, right? And whatever you need to do to get them to make that decision. And you sit them in a room with you, or you sit in their office, and you say, let me help you. You tell me what data you need, I'll give the data to you, and then we'll make that decision. But you gotta make it. So we can identify those people very early on. There's a risk that they could derail your project by not making a decision. And if you know you're gonna be working with somebody like that, you need to set up like a change board where they don't have control of the changes, not exclusive control, so that they can be outvoted and you can move on. But you got to have that progress. All right, so under our tools and techniques, we got a lot of things that help us with this, right? Documentation reviews. These are important, especially when it comes down to our work breakdown structure. Our WBS is identifying all the work that needs to be done to the best of our ability. Whenever possible, you should bring in a third party to evaluate the WBS and see if they reach the same conclusion. Is there any work that didn't make it in there? Did we leave something out? Because anything that we left out is going to introduce more time and more money that we may not have. All right. So a documentation review, but it's also a chance for us to look and see if there's any documents that haven't been created. Right. Is this project advancing without a charter?
Yeah.
I've seen that so many times. It's advancing without a charter, so it's got no authority. So this project could be canceled at any moment because it technically was never authorized to happen. We identify that right here, right? And we either fix it or the project ends, right? Nip it in the bud before execution starts. We're not going to be out a lot of money until execution starts. If you stop once execution is running, you've lost money. Yep. All right. We've also got our information gathering techniques. We reach out and we get any additional information we need. And there's a ton of ways to go about things like that. Let's see, do we?
Yeah, there's a few of them mentioned in our...
Let me pull up the notes here. Let's see, identify risks, and we've got those are all things we've kind of talked about. Went too far. There we go. So information gathering techniques, I know we've talked about some of these, like brainstorming we've talked about, interviewing we've talked about, root cause analysis we talked a little bit about. I don't think we've talked about Delphi at all, have we?
No.
All right, so Delphi technique is kind of neat. In a way, it's kind of like the nominal group technique, where we get a group of people and we get information from them, and in nominal, some people count more than others. There's a little bit of weight there, but you try and get ideas from all the various people. The Delphi technique goes a step further, and it says, when you get a bunch of people in a room, they affect each other. Yep. They affect and impact what each other thinks. One person feeds off of the next, or one person is subverted. I call it steamrolling. Every company has that employee who is super alpha type, right? Where they have an idea, and dadgummit, it is the best idea, and they won't listen to anybody else. And if somebody starts to promote other ideas, they steamroll them. They just throw out all this information, and it basically hinders other people from presenting their ideas. Eventually, they get to the point where they say, you know what? I'm just not even going to say anything because I know Bob in accounting is going to go all crazy, so I'll just let it go, right? Well, with Delphi technique, we do this. We say, let's do it anonymously. Let's have where we send out a questionnaire to everybody, and they fill it out by themselves. They fill out their ideas, their information, and we bring it all back together, and we don't necessarily know who did. I mean, you can do it with names, but normally you don't. So you don't know who provided these ideas, and now you can look at it unbiased and figure out which one is the best, and nobody has that opportunity to overrule or whatever. It's a neat technique. All right, root cause analysis. When we were talking a little bit about quality, we talked about this, that if we have a defect, what's causing it? What is the root cause? And there might be more than one cause, so we're looking for the main one, right? And when you're dealing with things like defects, there's always the symptom and the cause. Doctors talk about this a lot. Somebody comes in with a runny nose. Well, the runny nose is the symptom. What is the cause? oh, they've got a viral, sinus infection, right, or something like that. So the runny nose is a symptom. The sinus infection is the cause. So if we treat the runny nose, you give them like an antihistamine, that doesn't help with the sinus infection. So you've got to make sure you're finding out what that root cause is. So we basically break down whatever our problem is, whatever it is we're dealing with, and we try and find not just the symptoms, but what's actually leading to that to occur. And that's where those fishbone and Ishikawa diagrams that we talked about, that's where those come in. All right. The other things that we have are pretty common sense. Checklist analysis. In the quality process group or knowledge area, we came up with checklists to follow. When we're monitoring and controlling our project, how do we know if the things are getting done? We've got checklists, all right? Well, we need to look at those checklists and say, are they thorough enough? Are they properly cataloging the information to ensure success? Are there negative scenarios that can happen that this checklist is not going to capture? All right. Assumptions analysis. We've seen it on a few forms now where we document any assumptions we've made. Well, when we make an assumption, I can say, we're going to plan an outdoor rock concert, and I'm assuming that we'll be able to reserve some tents, and we don't actually have to rent them. We can just reserve them, and if we need them, we'll have them available. All right. So that's my assumption. Well, as we identify risk, we need to look at it and say, is that assumption realistic? Right? What company is going to offer for me to reserve tents for the day and not actually charge me full rental price? Because they can't use the tents if I reserved them, so I might as well be renting them. The only difference is whether I set them up or not. That might not be a realistic assumption. And so if we identify that, we need to change that assumption to become a fact. To be, no, that's not realistic. You need to plan for not paying a reserve price, but paying the full rental price, even if you don't use the tents. So that's the kind of thing we start with, assumption analysis. How accurate, how realistic were those assumptions? And is there anything we can do to make them more factual? Our diagram techniques, we saw a lot of diagrams in the shows yesterday, but you got your cause and effect diagrams, your flow charts, and your influence diagrams. Influence, what activities influence other ones. You see that with like your project schedule network diagram and stuff. So identifying that information, that's not really anything new. All right, but the big one here, the big new one that we've got, the one that's probably the most important technique, is what's called a SWOT analysis. A SWOT analysis is strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. You look at every activity in your project, every idea, every assumption, everything, and you say, all right, what are the strengths and weaknesses of how we're doing this? All right, we've chosen a way to achieve this goal. What's the strength of it? What makes this the right way? What are the weaknesses? What are the trade-offs I made by choosing this option? All right, and then after we figured that out, we say, all right, what are the opportunities and threats? Opportunities, what are the positive risks that I might be able to amplify or exploit? And then threats, what are the negative risks, the things that I need to avoid, I need to reduce whenever possible? All right, so maybe we're building a house and we're on a tight deadline. And so we say, all right, if we pour a full cement foundation, there's going to be like a 3-day wait while that thing dries. I don't have that kind of time. So what if we don't do a cement poured foundation? What if instead we just raise the house up 1.5 feet off the ground and build it without a true foundation? We'll just put those pylons down there and stand the house on it. All right. Well, the strength of that plan is that I don't have to wait 3 days for cement to dry. We can act as soon as those pylons are down. The pylons take an hour to put down, and then we're in business, right? There's my strength. My weakness, I don't have a foundation. And so if there is a tornado or earthquake or something like that, this house might be more susceptible to seismic activity or whatever, right? That might be my weakness. Or a skunk might move in under the house, right? Who knows? So there's my weakness. It might also affect the overall value of the house. Not having a true foundation might lower the value of the house. So these are weaknesses that we need to identify. And then we say opportunities and threats. What's my opportunity? My opportunity is that I could finish 3 days early. I could gain back 3 days so I'm not waiting on a foundation to dry. All right. My other opportunity is it might be easier for the plumbers to work because the plumbers can get under the house and run plumbing even after the floor is in. Maybe they couldn't normally do that. So now I can get the plumbers working at the same time as the electricians or whatever. So again, I can fast track my project and get things done faster. That's an opportunity. I need to look at the rest of my activities and find out where I might be able to fast track and how much I can shave time off. My threat, though, is we try and do this raised up house and some problem occurs. Some issue happens where I'm not able to perform something properly, or I violate code. Maybe the pylons don't sit right, and I end up having to spend 3 days just getting the pylons put in place, and now I end up in the same time schedule I had before, but without a solid foundation, right? So what can I do to minimize that, to ensure the pylons are put in properly, right? What kind of planning can I go through to mitigate that? We find all of that in a SWOT analysis, right? So real important that we do these. And how do we do that analysis? Well, we use a lot of these things. Expert judgment, meetings, Delphi technique, we use all these different things to find out from everybody else what they feel are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat, or SWOT. All right. If you look this up online, you'll find that there's many arguments as to what SWOT stands for. So there are other ones. But with PMI, strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. That's what you want to remember for the exam. All right. After we apply our expert judgment to all of that, we gather the data together, and now we create one of our super important documents, the risk register. And the risk register is just a list of all the risks. We're not coming up with mathematical data just yet. It's just identifying the risks. Some might be outlandish, some we might not even care about, but we need that list, we need the information, and we put it together. And I think I've got a risk register template. Yeah. Here we go. So here's an example of that risk register, and we'll look more into this a little bit later. But basically what you'll see is we create a risk statement, what that risk is, and that's all we're creating at this point. We don't have any of this other data just yet, okay? So we're just trying to fill out this risk statement, just listing in that name, and we'll fill the rest of the data out as we go. But it's basically going to include things like what's the probability of it happening, what's the impact at each phase, and so on, and we'll see how we get to that a little bit later. But that's an example of a risk register right there. Because it's just containing the name and not a lot of detailed data, we'll probably also create a risk data sheet. And the risk data sheet allows us to break down an individual risk and the data regarding it. So this sheet, we'd fill out one for every single risk we had. The risk description, the cause, the impact, any secondary or residual risk, contingency plans, all this. This is the detailed information about the risk. The risk register is kind of high level, right? Just the name of the risk and its other probabilities. And then the risk data sheet is where we go crazy, right? So when we're having a meeting where we're trying to identify risks, we probably just print out 50 or 60 of these, and then we fill them out as the meeting goes on, and then we populate the data as we get it. All right. Well, this is probably a pretty good spot for us to stop and take a break. So why don't we pause here? When we get back, we've got some more risk stuff to talk about, so we'll get into that. And it's risky business, right?
It is risky business.
All right. So ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We'll be back after this. All right, welcome back, everybody. So in the last process, we were talking about identifying the risks, and our goal was to come up with a great big list of risks, every risk that we could think of in our project. Anywhere we felt like the schedule might slip and cause the project to fall behind schedule, anywhere we might have a bad estimate, an estimate made on limited data where we might go over budget, anywhere that we identify risk in our project. The problem with doing something like that is now that we got this great big list, we have to figure out what to do about it. And some risks are more important than others. So for example, we have insurance on this building, on this studio that we're in. If there were a forest fire, which we seem to have all the time, if there was a hurricane, if something like that came through and tore this building down, insurance will cover it, we can build a new building, and we'll be back in business, right? But while the building is destroyed, it's going to knock us off air. And we're an internet company. We need to be on air. If we're not servicing our customers. So that's a big deal for us, right? And so we have contingencies in place to handle that, right? there's also a risk that a meteor could come down from outer space and just annihilate this building and wipe out our entire staff. It's real. It can happen, right? I saw that movie, Deep Impact. It can happen, right? But it's so unlikely. The odds of it happening are so, no pun intended, but astronomical. I'm very witty today. So astronomical that it's not even worth planning for something like that. It's not even worth thinking about because it's just super unlikely. I'll probably win the lottery 5 or 6 times between now and then anyway, and so we won't have to worry about that, right? So that's one of the things we need to think about when we deal with risk. And that's what leads us to our next process group, which is perform qualitative risk analysis. All right. Qualitative risk analysis is where we do the hard work. All of these risks that we just identified, we need to assign numbers to them so we can figure out what the heck they mean, right? We need to make it where we understand the importance. Every risk can be broken down into 2 characteristics: impact and probability. All right. And the concept is really simple. Probability. What's the likelihood that this risk is going to occur, right? And if it's a positive and negative risk, what's the likelihood of going either way, right? So we need to know that likelihood, because that's what's going to determine, in a large part, whether we need to deal with it. And then there's the impact. How big of a deal is it going to be, right? There is a risk. We have a show scheduled tomorrow, and more P&P. There's a risk that it might rain tomorrow, right? I know there's a risk. It's like a 30% chance of rain or something, which is a significant percentage. So odds are it'll probably rain tomorrow. But what's the impact, right? The impact is nothing. We shoot inside, right? It would have to be a really, really, really bad thunderstorm for us to not record, right? And that's happened a few times, but it has to be really bad. So even though there's a high likelihood that something's going to occur, let's say it was an 80% chance of rain tomorrow. Even though there's a high likelihood it's going to occur, the impact is so small, it's going to annoy us. Right. My shirt might be a little wet when I first come in, so I have to let that dry before we shoot. But other than that, not a big deal, right? So if the probability is high and the impact is low, we might not need to do anything. If the impact is high and the probability is low, we might not need to do anything. If both of them are high, if probability and impact are high, we absolutely need to do something. We need to do something to control that risk. And so that's what this process is helping us with. We're not planning what to do yet. We're just trying to identify the risks we need to worry about. So we go and we get that risk register that we just made, right? So that last process group had us create a list of all the potential risks that affect my project, all right? Now, we start to deal with it. Now, we also have our risk management plan and our scope baseline as inputs. Our scope baseline, that's going to be listing our budget, our schedule, and our requirements, right? As they are right now as part of our plan, unchanged by future events, right? So if things go the way we want them to, the scope baseline is going to hold true. What are the risks that center around it, all right? Then we apply a couple of simple things. We start off by doing what's called a risk, probability, and impact assessment. That means that we look at each risk in that list. We go line by line. If there's 5 risks, it's easy. If there's 500 risks, this is going to take a while, right? And on each one, we come up with a probability. What's the likelihood of it occurring? And it's possible that there's different likelihoods based on date and time, so we've got to really work that out. But what's the likelihood of it occurring? We need to assign a number, right? And we typically do percentages, right? 80%, 20%, whatever. Then we come up with a impact. And you can use whatever scale you want for impact. I generally use a scale of 1 to 10, right? And I do this because of the percentages we're doing on the probabilities. The probability 0% means something is absolutely not going to happen. 100% means it absolutely is going to happen. Now, is it a risk if it's 0 or 100%? No, right? Because it's a known fact at that point. You know it's not going to happen, or you know it is going to happen. It's not a risk anymore. It's just part of your project. But if it's 10% to 90%, or really 1% to 99%, now it's a risk. It could go either way, right? Same thing with impact, but I need to be able to compare the two together. So by putting impact on a scale of like 0 to 10, it's the same thing as the percentages that goes 0 to 100%, right? I have numbers that I can compare pretty easily. But it's up to you how you want to do your probabilities. So we just need to go down that list and assign a impact, right? So I might say on a scale of 1 to 10, this has an impact of 1, very little impact. Or this has an impact of 10, it will cause my project to fail without a doubt, right? That's my scale.
Right.
Well, in your risk management plan, you defined that. You defined what you consider your impact. Now remember the template I showed you had, what were they? It was high, very high, normal, low, very low, or something like that. So you might use that terminology for your impact. I like numbers. So I do scale of 1 to 10. Then, once you've gathered that data for every single risk, right? How significant is the risk? How much damage is it going to do? What's the likelihood that's going to occur? Then we can start to chart that out on what's called a probability matrix. The probability matrix is, it's one of my favorite documents because it's super simple. It's common sense and it really works out. And everybody who looks at it immediately understands what it does. So what I've got is I've got a few things. First off, I have my probability and impact assessment. All right. So for each risk, I'm going to come through and I'm going to catalog what is the scope impact, right? Is it very high? Is it very low or whatever? What's the quality impact, the schedule impact, the cost impact, right? These are all things we saw in the plan. What's the probability? How likely is it going to occur? All right. And then based on all of this information, I need to come up with what's called a risk rating. The risk rating is the risk as a whole, taking probability and impact into account. What is the odds I'm going to have to deal with this? And that risk rating comes from a combination of probability and impact. And to do that, I use a risk matrix. So let me pull up my my probability and impact matrix. All right. And that sounds like a really complex document, but it really isn't. It's pretty straightforward. What we do is we take a document like this, and this is working on the template terminology. If I say very low, low, medium, high, now I mentioned for me in real life land, I use numbers. So over here on the left, I might have my probabilities, starting with 10%, 20, 30, 40, all the way up to 90%. I don't normally bother with 100%, and I don't bother with 0. So we kind of map those up along the side. And then across the bottom, we have our impact. What is the impact on the project? How big of a deal is it going to be from very low all the way up to very high? Okay, so let's use our show as an example and say it might rain tomorrow. Okay, well, there's a 20% chance that it might rain tomorrow. So that is a fairly low probability. So looking at my list here, I'm going to say that's a low probability. So it's going to be in this row. And then I say the impact. What's the impact if it rains tomorrow? It's not a big deal at all for us. We have a roof, right? So I'll just put here chance of rain, right? So it might rain. So I'll just stick that right there in that box, all right? There could be a hurricane tomorrow, right? A hurricane, we are in hurricane, wait, are we in hurricane season right now? It starts in July, so it's not hurricane season yet. So it's very low, but let's say I'm planning for something in August, right, which is in the heat of the hurricane season here in Florida. So if it's in August, I probably have a medium chance of that hurricane, all right? If a hurricane comes through though, we will shut the studio down. So how will that impact our show? It's pretty high. I'm not going to put very high. It's not going to stop the show from ever airing again, but it'll shut us down for a day or two. So I'm going to put that in here, hurricane. Okay. All right. What about worker strike? Right. We're non-union, but if we had a worker strike, right? So Nate and Jason decide that's it. We're done. We're not going to work for your tyranny anymore. So they decide that and they walk off the set. Well, if we don't have a director and we don't have a producer, it's going to be really hard to do the show. Right. The show would have one camera angle and no credits and all that stuff. So the likelihood of that happening, I'd like to think, is very low. But who knows? Maybe the seeds of discord have been sown. So we'd have to evaluate our employee happiness there to determine the probability. The impact would be pretty high though. So I'm gonna put that over here under medium, and we'll just say like employee strike. All right. There might be other things though, like a meteor destroying the building. Very low probability that would happen, but very high impact. meteor strike, right? So that would be a big deal. All right. Let's go with something a little more realistic, though. All right. What about our internet connection fails? Now, we have a 40 megabit fiber optic connection that we feed our stream over, and so that's a pretty good connection, pretty rock solid. But things can go wrong, right? And in fact, they go wrong from time to time. We've had it happen a few times in the years we've had that line. So I'm going to put that up here at high, and the impact is pretty significant, right? If our internet connection goes down, we can't stream to you guys live. We can still record, and then we can put the show up, but we kind of lose that live thing, which is something that we pride ourselves in. So I'll put ISP failure here, all right? It's a high impact, a high probability and a high impact, right? I'm just kind of categorizing, right? Now notice how I've flagged some of these as red, some as yellow, some as green, okay? If something is in the red, that means it's got a high probability and a high impact. I absolutely need to deal with that. I need to find some way to either eliminate the risk or minimize the risk. All right. If something is in the yellow, I may not need to take direct action, but I do need to come up with some kind of a plan to deal with that. And then if something is down here in the green, that means it's either got a low impact or a low probability, or both are low, and in which case, I probably don't need to do anything at all. I can honestly tell you guys, we do not have a rain plan for tomorrow, all right? And it probably will rain tomorrow. It's looking kind of cloudy out there. So that's an example of a real thing. I know the risk, I identified it, but I'm not gonna deal with it. And in fact, meteor strike, it's got a high probability, so it's bumped all the way up here. But you know what?
What can you do?
I'm not going to deal with that either, right? We do have insurance and stuff, but I'm just not going to deal with it. It's just so unlikely. So, in the yellow, it's kind of a judgment call. In the green, it's pretty obvious we don't need to do anything. In the red, it's pretty obvious we do need to do something. So this is you'll hear it called a risk matrix or a probability and impact matrix, because you're comparing those two to determine where something falls, right? What its risk rating is. Now, this document itself is completely up to you. Here they're using terms, words. I use this, I modeled it after what's in the PMBOK. But in real life land, I use numbers. And I'll show you why a little bit later. Because when we create our risk rating, it's a lot easier if we have numbers. So we'll see that a little bit later. All right, so this is a big part of what we're doing right here in our qualitative risk analysis. Qualitative, we're looking at each risk and we're assigning values to it so that we can begin to categorize it, right? Now, we are going to move into quantitative risk analysis. And quantitative is where we start to compare the risks to each other, and we look at the overall level of risk of our project. So we're going to end up having to do both qualitative and quantitative, and it's easy to mix them up on the exam, so it's something we definitely want to memorize. I do have a lot more that I want to talk about here on qualitative risk, though. I want to run through some examples and kind of see that. So we'll take a look at that. But for right now, why don't we stop here and take a break?
Sounds good.
And when we get back, we'll pick back up with qualitative, and then we'll jump into some quantitative. It'll be exciting.
Sounds great.
All right, so stay tuned. We'll be back in a few. All right, welcome back, everybody. So before the break, we were talking about the probability and impact matrix. We were trying to plot that, and I mocked it up using the PMI, the PMBOK, the Project Management Body of Knowledge method, kind of their example. Let's pull this back up. So basically just kind of charting it with their very low, low, medium, very high, and so on. This is a good system.
Right.
It works, but it's not the system that I use in production, and it's not the system that they're forcing on you either.
Nope.
On the exam, you may see names like these, or you may see numbers. The PMI leaves it up to you. Basically, they say, come up with a way to grade your risks and just be consistent about it. So I'm a little more, normal, or
Normal.
not that I'm more normal. I said I normally tend to use numbers because they're easier to quantify. So I wanted to show you guys an example of that. So during the break, Ronnie and I banged out a quick Excel spreadsheet just to show you guys an example of how I normally go about this. And what I normally do is something like this. I create a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, and I use Excel. You could probably use anything. But basically, I come up with my risks. And for each risk, we just put in what the name of that risk is. And then we're going to pop in some information like the impact and probability. All right. So for a risk, I might have something like chance of rain, right? And there's a 80% chance of rain, but only a 2 for impact. The impact is extremely low. See how I'm doing a percentage for probability, but I'm just doing a whole number for impact. But I'm ranking them really both on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is absolutely no impact or absolutely no chance that it could happen probability-wise, and a 10 is total catastrophic impact or 100% chance probability that this is going to occur. So I'm really not going to see 0 or 10 or 0% or 100% because in those cases it's not a risk anymore. Now it's a known entity. But I'm going to see numbers 1 through 9 a lot. 1 being the lowest impact, 9 being the highest impact. 10%, I usually just do in tens. 10% is lowest probability, 90% is highest probability. So each of these might be categorized different ways. I might put here show host out sick.
Yep.
That's a possibility. I'm putting a 50-50 chance, right? 50% chance it happens, 50 or a 5 for probability. Impact. That's kind of the we have to bring in another host. It would affect half the show. Let's see if we said something that is another one that's like a low probability, low impact. Might be something like let's see. What would be a good one? We could do today. Let's do something like Don runs out of gas, or host has car trouble.
Yeah.
That's what happened yesterday. Host has car trouble. So it's a low possibility that it's going to happen, right? The probability is low. We don't have car trouble every day. And then the impact might be low because what do? The host calls in and says, hey, my car broke down. Can you come and get me? And somebody comes and gets him and brings him in. So it's inconvenient, but it doesn't derail one of our shows, right? I might have something that is a high probability or a low probability, high impact, right? Like a meteor strike is what I was saying before the break. It's a 10% probability. That's too high, but a really low probability. But if it happened, a 9 for impact, it would destroy our facility. We definitely wouldn't have a show that day, or ever again. And then we might have something that is a little more in line. I might put in here. Actually, I might do. Let's see, what would be a good one?
The hurricane again.
A hurricane?
Yeah, in hurricane season around here. It might be,
all right, we'll say that we're in hurricane season. There's an 80% chance that a hurricane is going to happen, and it'll have a 7 on the impact scale as far as affecting our show. So we just come up with whatever it is we think that there's going to be. Maybe there's a break-in, right? So somebody breaks into the studio and steals our equipment. Probability is low. We've been in this building like 5 years now. We've never had a break-in. Now I've jinxed myself. But, so our probability might be extremely low. So I'll just put in a 10% chance. And then my impact, well, that might be significant. If they steal our equipment, if we lose our cameras and all, it's insured, right? Insurance can get us stuff, but
won't have it.
It'll delay the show, right? We won't be able to record. So I'm going to put that impact a little bit on the higher side at like actually, we'll go 8. It's not catastrophic. It's not like we're out of business, but it would impact the show. All right. Now, from there, because I'm using Excel, I use a little chart to kind of throw all this together into a way that is meaningful. And so I've got this back here. And hang on, I just have to run a little macro real quick to name everything properly. So I'm just going to rerun this macro. There. Excel does this thing where it doesn't like to label the data points, and so we have to adjust it a little bit. But what you can see in here, I guess it is a little bit hard to see because of the colors, but basically I plot these out where we've got impact across the bottom on that scale of 0 to 10, and my probability on the left side from 0% to 90%, and it's plotting each of those risks out here, okay? And then what I've done is I've put a color gradient in here saying things down here are in the green, and green is okay, right? That's not a big deal. It's not going to hurt us. Probably not something we need to worry about. Yellow, that's something I need to start worrying about. And then red, that's something I absolutely need a plan for to get us to overcome, all right? So looking in here, I can see hurricane up in the red. That's something I need to have a plan for. What do we do if a hurricane comes through? Right? But down here, host has car trouble. Well, it's a low probability and a low impact. I really don't need to plan for that. I can go ahead and put in, hey, have a plan to go and pick somebody up if there's a problem, right? So I can state that. But otherwise, it's just kind of up to us. Now, when you do this, that level where we go from green to yellow or yellow to red, it's up to us where we draw that line. Every company is a little different, so you may need to manipulate that to match the needs of your organization, right? Everybody's a little bit different, and let me see here. So, like in Excel, you can go through and kind of tweak some of this stuff. So I might want to increase my green a little bit to bump up where I really get worried about things, and bump up my yellow a little bit, so that now there's more things kind of following in the green. It just depends on our organization what it is we think that that's going to affect us. And it may be that we don't even have a yellow, that we just go straight green. That's looking terrible. But that we go straight like that, because in this scenario, we've got things that we definitely don't deal with, and then we just kind of blend. It's entirely up to you how you want to go about it. You might not do that at all and just say, you know what, plot it out for me, and then let me just figure out. I've got break-in and meteor strike over here, but see how they're so low on the probability side, I probably just won't worry about them. But when we start getting into show host out sick or hurricane, maybe I do worry about that. And going back to the way that PMI listed here, even here we might choose to change this a little bit, saying like take these two cells here, and maybe we'll take them and switch them from being like yellow here, like I've got them right now, and go ahead and make them green, which of course is apparently not one of the colors I can pick. That's going to be a different green, isn't it? This is going to look terrible. Well, I guess I could have done something like that. Oh, that doesn't work. All right, well, whatever. You guys see what I mean, though, is that we could come in and take this and change these a little bit just to meet whatever it is that we're trying to achieve. So, yeah, I've picked some all new green that just looks horrible. There we go. That looks better. So you decide where it is that you need to lay out what you plan for and what you don't. It's different for every company. Everybody does things a little bit differently. All right. But the key thing is probability and impact are going to decide this. Now, we normally don't act on probability and impact alone. We normally combine the two. It makes sense to do it. And if you've used compatible values like I have, right, with this scale of 1 to 10, you can do something really easy to create what's called a risk rating. All right. A risk rating has one of the simplest formulas in the entire PMBOK. A risk rating is simply probability times impact. So you take your probability, you multiply it by your impact, and whatever number you get, that's your risk rating. And you might have noticed in my spreadsheet over here, I have Excel doing that for me. I have it taking whatever I plug into these two and multiplying it out. So when I look over here at this risk rating column, I can see that chance of rain has a risk rating of 1.6. But show host out sick has a risk rating of 2.5. This makes it very easy to compare these numbers together, and I'm going to need that when we get to the quantitative risk analysis. So we're still doing qualitative right now. I'm just qualifying each risk, looking at them, figuring out their details. I'm not really doing comparisons just yet. That's going to come with quantitative. All right, so those are some of the things that are available to us there as far as probability and impact, right? We map it out in a risk register, right, as we list our risks, and then we map it out in a matrix, if you want, to figure that out. You don't really need the matrix because you can just use the simple mathematical equations to do it too. Just remember, probability times impact equals your risk rating. All right, then we have our risk data quality assessment. Your data is only as good as the data you use to formulate it, right? When I talked about these risks here, I said there's a chance of rain tomorrow and it's 80%, okay? Where did I get that from? Well, I made it up. I just made it up off the top of my head, right? Maybe I went a little more scientific and went to weather.com, so I fired up weather.com and I got the data from there. So I want to know what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, so I punch in our zip code and the weather for, where do you find tomorrow? Here, tomorrow. Okay. So according to weather.com, the weather tomorrow is going to be 90 degrees with evening thunderstorms, chance of rain 60%. So weather.com is saying 60%. So I could stop right here. That's where I got my data. Okay. Well, what's the quality of my data? How accurate is weather.com? Have they done well over the last year? Are they wrong this amount of time or that amount of time? What's the error rate of their data? maybe I want to go and use somebody else for my data, right? So maybe I want to use AccuWeather, right? So I'll go to AccuWeather, and I'll punch in their data. Oh, they've already found me. Ooh, ominous, right? So, so they found me in Gainesville, Florida, and tomorrow, it looks like they're saying a high of 89, so a little bit different. And are they giving us a generic chance of rain?
That's 64%, indeed.
Okay, I'll try. I don't see it, but I'll trust you. So, so 64% is what they're saying. So I had 60% on Weather.com, 64% on AccuWeather. Which one's right? Right?
Yeah.
Maybe I go ahead and take a third one, and I bring in like Weather Underground, right? So I'm just trying to think of anybody.
Yeah.
And so I bring up Weather Underground. I punch in old Gainesville here, which they already found us too. And I want tomorrow. 10-day forecast, so you know that's going to be accurate. So so tomorrow is Friday, and we got a chance of thunderstorms, and boy, they lay it out here kind of crazy, don't they? But
by hour, just about.
yeah, and you know that sometimes you get too much information,
Yeah.
right? It makes things difficult. So do we have like just a generic, straight-up percentage? I don't want an almanac. I'm not Benjamin Franklin
right
here.
there would be the only thing.
6%
Yep.
humidity.
Is that today?
You know, see this information is already too hard to interpret. So anyhow, well, let's just say it's 62%, right? So now I've got three values, 60, 62, and 64%, which is right. Maybe I average them together, right? So I just got three values, just average them and be done with it. So the accuracy of my data, where did I get that data from? How accurate is it? Did somebody just guess? Am I going off of one subject matter expert's estimate, right? Where did I get that from? So we've got to make sure that our data is accurate as possible, and the risk data quality assessment does exactly that. We just look and make sure that we have some factual basis, and we document it. The important reason we document it is if we're wrong, we need to see why. Why were we wrong? Was it our fault? Did we just not do our due diligence? Did we not do good prep work? Or was it something out of our control? Everybody predicted 60% chance of rain, but then on that day it ended up being, 100%, or while it's raining, it's always 100%, right? So keep that in mind. We also have risk categorization. Now, risk categorization, it depends on you, how you want to categorize things. You can categorize them based on mitigation techniques, ways that you would handle them. You can categorize them based on the areas that they affect, right? If they affect your schedule or your budget or so on, that's what I normally do. Or you can categorize them based on who's responsible for them. It's up to you. Some people categorize them just based on the deliverable inside of the work breakdown structure they affect. So figure out what works for you. The main reason we want to categorize them is so that we can evaluate our risk on a per category basis. And we don't do that here in this process, but we do it in quantitative risk analysis in the next process. All right. You also have a risk urgency assessment. There are some risks that we need to deal with immediately. All right. If we're planning an outdoor rock concert 3 months from now, and there's a chance that it could rain, we need to secure the tents now, because the tents might not be available 2 weeks before the show, right? So some risks have a high urgency that we need to immediately deal with. Other risks, there may not be any point in dealing with too far ahead of time, right? One of the performers might be sick. What can I really do now, 3 months early, to make sure that a performer doesn't get sick? You stick him in a bubble? There's not really much you can do. So there's not a lot of urgency around that risk. The higher the probability and impact of a risk, the more urgent it becomes, right? The lower the probability and impact, the less urgent, because low probability, low impact is not really going to affect our project. All right. And then expert judgment, right? If you happen to be fortunate enough to have a risk manager or some kind of risk consultant, they will help you to no end, right? They're worth their weight in gold. Well, most of them. Like any profession, there are some that aren't, but most of them are. So they can really help you out. If you don't have that and you're on your own, well, you need to get all the information you can. So bring in subject matter experts for the individual areas of your project and get their best opinion over the risks. All right. Now, the only thing we generate here with qualitative risk analysis is project document updates. The reason is, we've probably already created a lot of these documents. Now, they don't list that risk matrix is an output, even though it technically is. Here's where we create it. So you don't see that. But what we're really doing is we're updating our risk register. Right. So this risk register over here, and you might remember from the templates I brought up at the beginning of the show that the risk register itself doesn't have a ton of data, but it does have probability and impact. So as we get that information, we plug it right in here. And see where it's got score? That's the risk rating. Probability times impact equals the risk rating. So they just call it score in this particular template. All right. There's also, instead of the risk register, there is the risk data sheet. And here's where we do the same thing, probability, impact, score, but we go a step further to include things like risk cause, risk responses, contingency plans, other data surrounding that. And we're going to talk about risk response plans in 2 more processes. So we'll get to that towards the end of the show. All right. So definitely things that we want to be aware of. And this is a great place to put information on where we got our data from. So we've got that documented. All right. So those are pretty much the things we need to think about as far as qualitative risk analysis. Just remember, the main goal of qualitative risk analysis is to assign values to your risk to make it possible to compare them, right? We need to qualify each risk to understand the significance or lack of significance of that risk, right? Once we're done with that, we usually immediately move into quantitative risk analysis. Very similar words, very easy to confuse. Qualitative, we're looking at individual risks. Quantitative, we look at the big picture. All right, so let's see that. Let me bring up that process group here. All right, in quantitative risk analysis, we take our inputs, and our inputs, the main one is the risk register, right? Because really all the other stuff, risk management plan, cost management plan, schedule management plan, a lot of that stuff went into our qualitative risk analysis already. So we don't normally need to harvest that information together. We've already acted upon it. What we're really looking for is that risk register that's now nice and populated with probability and impact, right, and a risk rating. And that's when we can start to go in and compare our data and make some important decisions, right, some very important decisions. So the first thing we need is data gathering and representation techniques. And what they're talking about there is, of the data that we've gathered, we need to be able to show it in a way that's meaningful to the people we talk to, that's meaningful to our CEO, to our sponsors, to our stakeholders, right? So we gather our data through any of a number of techniques, and the book specifically calls out interviewing, right? So we interview people, gather that data, and then we do probability distributions, all right? There are some events that may have different probabilities based on certain criteria. A great example is here in Florida, people calling in sick. There is a greater instance of people calling in sick in the springtime than any other time of the year. And the reason is, in Florida, we have a pollen count that is ridiculous. There's so much pollen in the air in spring, it affects the gas mileage of your car. Yeah. That it's crazy. So in the spring, people's allergies flare up, people get sick, and they call in. It happens every year. So and it kind of coincides with flu season or the end of flu season. So it's a big deal. So if I'm trying to calculate employees calling in sick, I need to account for a higher probability, a higher incidence of that in January, February, March. But then for the rest of summer, it drops back down to normal levels. So depending on the day I look, it's going to be different. And so we may have a probability distribution. Things are changing based on the time frame or whatever it is that I'm measuring against. So be aware of that. You'll see that especially in execution, when we're executing our project, when real work is getting done. Different phases of the project might be more dangerous or hazardous than others, and so we might have higher workers' comp claims, things of that nature. All right, so then we're ready to do our actual quantitative risk analysis. And this can be very simple. It can also be very complex. It can be really hard. It's up to you how exact you want to get on this, all right? We already have our probability and impact, and from those we've extrapolated a risk rating for our risks, all right? Now, we need to make some kind of a decision, all right? A decision is going to center around 2 things. One, what risks should we manage and how do we manage them? And 2, what level of risk does the project as a whole have, and whether or not I should even move forward with the project, all right? The first one we already talked about. We've got a probability and impact for each of our risks. We calculated a risk rating. Now we just need to set a bar and say anything over this number we need to plan for. So maybe I set that bar at 1. Anything with a score over 1.0, I want to deal with, okay? So I go back to my spreadsheet, right? And I look at my risk ratings over here, and I can see like chance of rain has a 1.6, host out sick has a 2.5, host has car troubles only a 0.6, meteor strike is a 0.9, right? Hurricane 5.6, break-in 0.8, all right? So I say anything over a 1.0 is something I want to deal with. So I'll need to build a plan for chance of rain. I'll need to build a plan for show host out sick. I'll need to build a plan for hurricane. But these other things, I'm just going to do what's called risk acceptance. I'm just going to accept that they could happen, and I'll deal with them when they happen. But they're just so either improbable or low impact that I'm not worried about it, right? But I need to set that bar. Where do you set the bar? Well, there's no formula for that. There's no mathematics. Well, a risk manager has certain statistical analyses they can do. But normally it comes down to your company's willingness to accept risk. Are you risk averse? Then you're going to set this bar very low. Are you a risk seeker? Then you're going to set this bar very high. Why waste time planning for risks that aren't likely to happen anyway, right? So I'll just set the bar high, right? Or are you risk neutral? You'll evaluate the likelihoods of each of these and start to set the bar based on the numbers you get, right? Also, what about the risks as a whole? I only listed 6 risks here, but you'll see my spreadsheet, I go down to 100. When we do a risk analysis on a project, it's very common that you can have 50, 100, 200 different risks. Every single work package has some kind of risk, right? So you may have a lot of risks across your project. What happens if you total up all the risk that you have, right? So if we add up these numbers and divide it by the total. So Ronnie, how do you do an average? Is it average? Oh, it is. So if I use good old Excel here, and I'm just going to do an average of my risk ratings, okay, I can see my overall average is a 2.0, right? I need to set a bar that says, when is a project too risky? When is there just too much risk in my project? And there's so much risk that I say, you know what? I don't want to do it anymore. Let's just cancel that. Let's not do that project at all, okay? If there's enough high probability, high impact risks, if there's enough things that could derail your whole project, you need to set a limit that says, oh, I've hit that limit, I am not doing it. This project needs to stop. There's just too much risk in the project as a whole, okay? Where do you set this bar? Again, it depends. Are you risk averse? Are you a risk seeker? Are you risk neutral? This is the kind of thing that you set up in your risk management plan. In your risk management plan, you might say anything with a average risk rating of 3.0 or higher, we will not do, you know, unless you can mitigate it. Because some of the stuff you can mitigate. Some of it you might look at and you could say, you know what? All right, there's a chance that a show host could call out sick. So for now on, what I'm going to do is every time we schedule a show, I'm going to schedule 3 hosts. I'll schedule 3 hosts. That way, if one calls in sick, I still have 2, the show goes on, right? So by mitigating that risk, my cost is going to go up. I got to pay a third person to stand here, a third person I might not even use, right? But my show host out sick, the probability didn't change. It's still the same likelihood of happening, but now the impact drops to negligible, right? I don't really care if they're out sick because I've already got the extra person handy. So if we see our number is too high, we make a go, no-go decision, okay? Either we go, we run with the project as it is, or we do a no-go and say, as it is, this project is dead in the water unless we can get the risk down. And we start evaluating our risk responses, which is the next process, and what we can do to lower it. Once we lower it, we come back and we revise our risk. Notice back here in my templates that in the risk data sheet, see how I've got a probability right here and then a revised probability. What's that all about? Well, yeah, there was a certain risk when I first came in and flagged this as something to deal with. So here it is. This is the risk as it was in the beginning. But our risk was too high. So we took some kind of action to reduce it. So now, here's my revision. Now, here's what's the probability. And so I go and I update my register to show those lower values. Now my overall project risk drops down and the project moves forward. All right. This is the cornerstone of quantitative analysis. I don't know this information unless I'm comparing all of my risks together. I might look at it and have a bunch of mid-level risks. No one risk by itself is that big of a deal. But what if 2 risks happen at the same time? Or 3 or 5, and they're all negative risks, right? Not positive. You want 5 positive risks to all happen at once. But what if all those negative risks happen at the same time? Then it could become a high impact event, even though none of the risks by themselves were there. By averaging these numbers, we're taking that into account, right? By averaging this together, we're averaging these probabilities, we're averaging these impacts, and creating something a little more useful, okay? And you could even go further. You know, I did the average of the risk rating as a whole, but you could come up with an average probability and an average impact and kind of look at those and see just whether you're dealing with a lot of high-level risk or not. I find those numbers are less useful. The average of the risk rating is the most useful. Mm-hmm. All right, so quantitative risk analysis and modeling, that's where we start to look at that. What is our overall risk? How risky is the project as a whole? What's our percentage of failure, right? If we're creating a large chance of failure on this project, we probably need to rein it in. Mm-hmm. All right. Under analysis and modeling techniques, we do have a few other things. Sensitivity analysis, that is, you know, how sensitive, I want to say paranoid. That's not the right word for it. But you know, how risky is our project? Mm-hmm. If we have a lot of high risk stuff, then it's a very sensitive project. Any of those risks could come through and undermine the project. So obviously we want projects that aren't terribly sensitive, mm-hmm. that are resilient, that if they have failures, it doesn't derail the whole project. Expected monetary value analysis. This one's a tough one. We're going to get into earned value, EVA, and all that good stuff in the monitoring and controlling phases. So we're going to see that a little bit later. But basically, when you perform a project, the whole point is to improve your company somehow, and typically to make more money. And so EMV, the expected monetary value, that's where we can look at our project and come up with what we expect our financial gain to be. And if we have enough risk, we may have to take so many mitigating techniques or steps that we offset that expected monetary value, and that really starts to hurt things. Right. So, you know, that's a real thing that a lot of companies deal with. Have you ever seen, you go to a sporting event, baseball, football, hockey, whatever, and at halftime, they bring just your average Joe off the street out into the middle of the field, and they say, let's use hockey because that's a little more international. So they stick a guy right there in the center of the rink, and they say, if he can shoot the puck halfway across the rink and get it into this little hole in the goal, he'll get $1 million. $1 million. Okay? Well, if the guy makes it, he gets $1 million. Whoever put on that contest is out $1 million. But if he misses it, he doesn't get anything, and the company that put this on just gets great publicity, right? So, do you think they've got a stack of $1 million sitting in a back room waiting for that guy to make it? Absolutely not. Instead, they buy insurance. They buy insurance that says, if this guy makes it, the insurance company will pay that $1 million and not us. But if the guy misses it, well, we just pay our insurance premium and that's it. And so they reach out to, usually it's like, was it Sotheby's? Yeah. I think, well, no, that's not right. What's the big...
Sounds good to me. Lloyd's of London.
Lloyd's of London, that's it. Thank you, Jason. So Lloyd's of London, these guys, they'll insure anything you can think of. And so they run the statistics. What are the odds of your average Joe off the street shooting a puck halfway across an ice rink and getting it into a hole this big, right? And so they calculate the odds. And then based on those odds, they calculate a dollar value that they could get paid where they will accept that risk for us. It's called risk transference. We're transferring the risk over to the insurance company. We're going to come out some money. Let's say it's $100,000, right? Let's say that Lloyd's looks at it and they say, wow, there is like a 2% chance this guy can make it, but we're going to charge you 10%, all right? So you want to give away $1 million, we're going to charge you $100,000. That's what we'll do, all right? So if you are, Coke or Pepsi or whoever's putting this thing on, you pay the $100,000. You pay the $100,000 so you don't have to pay $1 million if it happens.
Yeah.
And so you pay $100,000, you're out that money. If the guy misses, Lloyd's just made $100,000, and they've got a 98% chance of that happening. But if that guy makes it, then Lloyd's is out, $900 and whatever $1,000. So they're out a ton of money, but there was only a 2% chance that it was going to happen, right? And that's part of what expected monetary value analysis does, is it lets us look at that and come up with a concept. So like what do we stand to gain? How much do we stand to lose? What the average outcome will be, right? We're trying to figure that out, and it all falls under this umbrella term of analysis under uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if Bob from Akron, Ohio, who's been a mailman for 30 years, we don't know if he can shoot that puck across the ice rink and make it, but we got to take a guess, right? And the better the information we have, the better off we will be. All right, so those are some of the things that we've got to keep in mind as we deal with quantitative risk analysis. We've got our expert judgment, and then at the end of the day, we output our data. So we've got our risk register, and you may choose to create a risk evaluation sheet or something of that nature, but typically it's just updates to your risk register to put that information in. Any responses we'll talk about later, but you're going to put in there any probabilities, impacts, and any mitigation techniques that we've got, and that's basically it. So I make it sound easy. Well, maybe I don't. I don't know. In my mind, it sounds easy. It is easy when you're talking about one risk, but the problem is you're going to have a meeting, you're going to sit down, and you're going to come up with potentially hundreds of risks. And so you've got to go through and look at each one. So while it takes us an hour to tell you about the process, it may take you weeks or even months. If you're putting a man on the moon, it could take years to look at all the risks and figure them out. So definitely keep that in mind. All right, well, we've talked a lot about evaluating our risks, looking at them. Now we need to talk about what we do to handle it, how we get out of a mess if it occurs, all right? So let's stop here and take a break, because I did go over our little break timer. So let's stop here and take a break, and when we get back, we're going to take a look at our risk response plan, which is probably the most critical of the different steps here inside of the risk knowledge area. So let's stop here and take a break. When we get back, risk response plans. All right, welcome back, everybody. So by this point, we have created a list of all of our project risks. We understand the dangers that are out there. We have qualified and quantified those risks. So we've evaluated, how significant they are, whether we need to deal with them. So now we're at the point where we do the last part, which is we figure out how we're going to deal with them, right? We've got a risk response, how we're going to respond to the risks in the event that they occur. Now, there are responses that we take if the risk doesn't occur, and there's proactive responses we take early on. So there's all sorts of different stuff that can happen right here. This process is deceptively simple, right? We've just seen some processes that were pretty heavy, right? That had, like this guy right here, 13 inputs and all that. So this one looks simple, but it's probably the hardest to do in real life because there's so many different ways to solve a problem, and we've got to figure out which one is the best for us. All right, so on our input side, our main input is going to be our risk register, and then we have our risk management plan, which is telling us how these things are available to us, how we can respond, what tools are there as an option for us. But our risk register is the main input because it lists all the risks and which ones are significant enough for us to worry about. All right, now we need to find out what to do. So on our techniques here, our tools and techniques, we've got strategies for negative risks and strategies for positive risks. There's a difference, right? Obviously, a negative risk we don't want to happen, so anything we do is trying to minimize that occurrence. But a positive risk we do want to happen, so any response we take there is trying to make it better and better, right? What is the most likely way we can do that, all right? So let's talk a little bit about those, and Ronnie threw out some good notes here on this one. On a negative risk, there's really 4 different responses, right? Avoid, transfer, mitigate, accept. Let's talk about each one. Avoid. You can take a look at a risk and say, this risk exists, What can I do to 100% completely eliminate it? All right. So I'm planning an outdoor rock concert. There's a chance it could rain. I'm worried about that. So instead of trying to reduce the chance of rain, which is hard to do, right? Yeah, I imagine it's possible. I could instead say, you know what, forget it.
Inside.
Let's have an indoor. Yep, we move that rock concert indoor, and when we do that, we just avoided the risk. The risk is gone. I no longer have the risk of rain. It could still risk, or it could still rain, right? That could still happen, but it no longer affects my project in any way. I've completely avoided the risk. This is the nicest, right? Because it does eliminate the risk, but it's also not always possible, right? If I have to get some stuff transported from one city to another and it's going in truck, there is a risk the truck could be in an accident, right? How can I avoid that? Well, I really can't. I got to get the stuff from one city to another. I could fly it, I could send it by train, but they all have a risk of being in an accident, and they're a lot more expensive, so I may have to use that truck. So I might not be able to avoid. And in those cases, we start to move into some of the other options. We've got transfer. Risk transference, I talked about in the last segment. It's buying insurance normally is how it is. This is where you say, all right, the risk is there, not much I can do about it. Let me put the negative effects off on somebody else. When you buy car insurance, health insurance, any kind of insurance, if you're playing blackjack, and you buy dealer's insurance when they lay out a 10 card, well, in those scenarios, you're saying there's some risk here that I'm going to lose. Let me push it off on somebody else. And the trade-off is that you're paying them, and in the event that the risk doesn't occur, they just keep that money, right? They make money betting on it not happening. You're paying them in case it does happen. You're both just betting different ways. The odds are stacked in their favor. The odds are always stacked in the insurance company's favor, but boy, you'll be glad you had it if that risk comes to fruition. So we definitely want to be aware of that, and transference is one of the most common. Now, key thing to remember about transference for the exam, if you transfer the risk to somebody else, does that reduce the probability of that risk? No. Does it reduce the impact of the risk? Not really. It does a little bit in that at least it's not you having to pay out that money. You don't have to set up a cash reserve, right? But it's still going to be impactful. So those are things that you have. In a business like this, so here at IT Pro TV, we have what are called key man insurance policies, right? The assumption is if I'm the host of the show and I get in a car accident and that's it, I'm out, right? Or something happens, I catch some rare Malarian plague or something like that, and I'm done for, right? Does that affect the show? Yeah. So we have a key man policy that says, hey, if this person knocks off, that we need some money to compensate that so we can hire somebody better and send Nate to acting school or something and get the show going that way. So that's great, but we still lost the host, right? I'm still out of commission. So we still have to deal with that, but at least the money makes you feel a little better, right? So keep that in mind with risk transference. It oftentimes has zero effect on probability, and it has a minimal effect on impact. So those are still there. At least we get monetary compensation. All right, mitigate. Mitigate is the one that we most commonly do. With mitigate, we say, all right, we can't really transfer this to somebody else. We can't avoid it. Let's just try and reduce the probability as much as possible. So that outdoor rock concert. In Florida, we have a very pronounced rain season. It starts raining here sometime in March. Yeah. And it pretty much rains through May. Yeah, really. And we get a lot of rain right here. And then it does the same thing at the end of summer. So like from the end of July through about September, it rains. So if I put on a rock concert in those months, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to get rained out, right? But if I put on the concert in November, or if I put it on in July, odds are it's not going to rain, right? I can improve my chances of having a dry concert by picking which month I put it in. That's mitigating the risk. I'm not eliminating it. There's still a chance it's going to rain, but I reduce that probability, all right? If you are, what are some other examples of mitigating? I gave an example earlier, which was if we have two show hosts and one calls in sick, Ronnie calls in sick, I gotta stand up here by myself, right? It affects the show. But what if I book a third host? I have a third host ready, standing by, waiting to jump up here if we need them, right? And if Ronnie calls in sick, that other person jumps in and off we go. Ronnie was still sick, that happened, but I've got a backup plan, right? I guess that's more of a contingency than a mitigation. You know, a better example of mitigation might be I get everybody flu shots,
Yes.
right? I know that we might get sick, and so maybe as a company, IT Pro TV decides to go ahead and pay for flu shots. We're going to pay for Ronnie and Nate and Mike and Wes and everybody who's on the show, Jason, everybody gets a flu shot, right? I'm willing to pay that because it will reduce the chance of them getting sick. I'm mitigating that.
Yeah.
All right. And then the last one is accept. Accept is what we do when we're saying this is just a low probability of occurring, right? So I'm going to go ahead and accept the risk. I'm not going to do anything. I know that there's a chance that Jason's car might break down on the way to work tomorrow, right? I know the odds are increased because it's, 18 years old? So, so the odds are somewhat increased. I'm not going to do anything about it, right? I'm not going to do anything about it because tomorrow I know that Ronnie and I are going to be the host of the show, and I know that I could always get Nate, our producer, to jump in and cover Jason until he gets in. So we kind of already have things in place. So I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to accept that risk and just leave it be, right? If it's a low impact, or if it's a low probability, or if they're both low probability and impact, then we may choose to accept that risk and just not act upon it, right? So that is something that we can do, and in a lot of cases that's fine. The meteor thing, I'm accepting that risk. I don't have a meteor plan in case this building gets destroyed by meteor. I'm accepting that risk, right? So when we look at our risks, we need to find out which of these 4 things we're going to do, right? You're doing one of these 4. If you ignore it, you're accepting, right? So we either avoid, transfer, mitigate, or accept. Those are the 4 we do for a negative risk. Now, on a positive risk, if it's an opportunity, right? I know that I need to buy lumber to build this house, all right? So my project is to build a house. I know I'm going to buy lumber. I know that there's 2 different risks at work here. There's a risk the price of lumber could go up from what I quoted in the planning phase, all right? That's a real risk. How can I mitigate that? I can make sure I buy the lumber early and not wait, right? But there's a risk that the price of lumber could go down. And if I buy lumber later, I might save money. So what do I do? You know, how do I handle that? How do I make that decision? Well, I'll tell you, in computers, it's almost a guarantee that the price will go down, right? So if I know that in my project I'm going to need to buy 400 computers, I might buy them in batches, depending on when I need them. I might buy 100 this month, and 100 the next month, and 100 the third month, and 100 the fourth month, knowing that each month that price might go down, and I save money by doing it that way. Worst case scenario, the price will stay the same, right? Because I've got a quote from that vendor. So if I know the price is going to stay the same, why not wait to see if the price goes down? Or you might be able to use that in your negotiations and tell the vendor, well, you know what? I'm thinking about buying these month by month in case the price goes down, unless you'll give me a bulk discount. If I buy all 400 right now, will you give me a bulk discount that basically equals what pricings I might have if I ride this and see? And a lot of times you can do that. And you can take that benefit early, right? You save that money. So what we're doing here is we're doing what's called exploiting the risk. We're doing whatever we can to make it more likely that that could happen. What can I do to ensure that the price of that computer is as good as it's going to get, that I take advantage of that, right? That I don't just get a quote that's 3 months old and then buy on that quote. That if it's been 3 months, I go ahead and get a new quote because I know it's gone down, right? Or with lumber, maybe I buy it all now to lock it in, or I buy it in batches hoping that that price goes down. Or I build that into my project and I say, before you buy lumber, look at where the pricing has been and try and get it when it's at a valley instead of a peak, right? So we can build that into our project plan. Enhance is another one. What is something that we can do to enhance the risk, right? A good example here, that outdoor rock concert. I know I'm going to do an outdoor rock concert, and probably be a good idea to have a concession stand, right? It's outdoors. People get thirsty. They want a water or something, a snack. We can make some good money on that concession stand. Well, there's a risk that I could sell like crazy out of that concession stand, and I could run out of soda, right? Well, that might be something I want to enhance. I want to enhance the likelihood that I run out of soda. I want to sell out all my inventory. I don't want to be stuck with inventory after this concert. I want to sell it all, right?
Right.
So how can I enhance that risk? I could schedule the concert during the hottest month of the year. I could throw it right in August, right? August is miserable in Florida. And I can schedule it right there in August, and I know it's going to be 98 degrees out there all day long, and people are going to be buying that water like crazy. And I'll sell it for $4 a bottle, right? This is what they do at concerts. They gouge the customers. But we can enhance it by doing that. If I had the same concert in February, it's going to be nice and cold. Rains might be coming in, might be overcast. I might not sell much water at all, right? So what can I do to enhance that risk, make it more likely to occur? We can share the risk, okay? Sharing an opportunity, this is a tough one, right? With sharing it, I might say, you know what? There is a chance the price of lumber might go down and I get to save money, but I don't want to mess with that. I don't want to deal with the prices going up and down and so on. It's just it's a hassle. So instead, what I'll do is I'll hire a buyer. There are several companies out there that will act as buyers for you, all right? They have different names, personal shopper, whatever, but they're buyers, right? And you say, look, I need to buy lumber. I want you to get me the best price of lumber. Here's a quote I got. I got this quote. This is what I'm planning on paying. If you can get it for less, I'll split the difference with you 50%, right? You can keep half. Now, you're splitting it with them. They're doing the work of going out and trying to find this lumber cheaper, negotiating, beating people up, trying to get the best price possible. So they're doing stuff that you're not doing anyway. You are already ready to pay your quoted price. So if they can get it cheaper and you split the difference with them 50-50, you save money that you weren't going to save already, and they make money by negotiating and buying at a cheaper rate. That's sharing the risk. You share it with them because if they can't get it cheaper at the end of the day, you don't split anything with them, right? And so it didn't cost you anything, but it didn't benefit them either, right? That's sharing the risk, and it's great. There's a number of organizations out there that do this, and there's no reason not to, right? You do take a little risk that they could totally screw up, but the benefits are usually nice. And then we've got acceptance, just like on the negative side. We can say, there's a chance we could get it cheaper, but whatever. We'll accept it. If it happens, great. If it doesn't, whatever. We're not worried about it. I like to call that the government approach. So on that one, government, it is a different world. If you get a quote and it's like a legally binding quote or whatever, the act of trying to get it cheaper can sometimes involve a ton of paperwork. And so you just accept the risk to get it done, because otherwise you jeopardize your schedule. So I make fun of the government, but when you've got an entity that big, a lot of times you don't have a choice. So that's how it plays out. All right. So those are some of the techniques there. Remember, on a negative risk, on a threat, it is avoid, transfer, mitigate, accept. You're trying to dodge that risk or minimize it. On a positive risk or an opportunity, it is exploit, enhance, share, and accept. You're trying to get the most out of it. You want it to happen, right? So different techniques, well, with the exception of acceptance, different techniques for them as far as what you're going to do. All right. Now, when we start to look at these risks, there's a chance they could happen, and there's a chance they might not happen. If they don't happen, what do? Stay the course, right? Things go as planned. The risk didn't happen. We ignore it. We move on. Everything's going according to plan. If the risk happens, then we have to act, right? Then we have to do something. So if that risk happens, now what do? Right? Well, that's where we have our contingent response strategy. Contingency, plan B, right? Plan A was for this risk not to happen. Plan A was for us not to have a hurricane next month. But we got a hurricane. So now we got plan B. What's plan B? Plan B might be we close the studio for a few days and we don't record those days. All right? Hopefully our studio doesn't get destroyed and we'll be back in business. All right? Or we might have a plan C or a plan D. It just kind of depends on what's going on, right? So a contingency is just that, the plan B. So what are our response strategies for those contingencies? And it's really kind of coming back to these guys. Did we plan on avoiding or exploiting, enhancing? When we figure out what we want to do, that is our contingent response. That's our risk response, what we're going to do to fix our mess, right? Or it might be a good mess, right? It might be a positive risk. we invented some new product and sales are just through the roof. We went viral on YouTube or something, and now it's gone nuts. So, how do we get the most out of that? That's our contingency. The important thing is, think of it now. Think of it right now before the risk happens. That way, when the risk happens, you're not scrambling trying to figure things out. You've already got it. You've got documented. Here's what I need to do to get beyond this and move forward. All right. So that's pretty much our process here. We've got expert judgment again, which is use your noodle, use your common sense. You'll find opportunities that are there to get past these. All right. When we're done, our outputs, and the outputs look really simple, but they're not. Right? This is again, it's deceptive. Project management plan updates. If we didn't have a risk management plan, we had to come up with our response strategies, how we were going to respond. That stuff is going to make it into our project management plan, in particular our risk management plan. But this is where it gets challenging right here, project document updates. Now, we've seen that as an output on several other ones, and I've always said, well, if you update your plan, you got to go and update it, maybe have some minor changes here. But depending on your risk response strategies, this is the first time where we might have drastic change, okay? If we decided to transfer a risk to somebody, okay, we're pushing that risk off to somebody else by buying insurance. We got to pay for that insurance. Yeah. Our budget is now affected. Our scope might have defined the budget. Now we got to go and update the scope. That's a big change. Doing that here in planning is okay. Doing it in execution, monitoring, controlling is a nightmare. So we want to make sure we do this early, but that means there's a lot of things that can change. And Ronnie, you did an awesome job here listing out all the different things that might change, right? Our risk owners and our agreed upon strategies, we're creating those, we're putting those in the risk register, right? We saw that when I pulled up the risk register here. You've got your risk statement, and then you've got your response. What are you going to do about that risk, right? And then in our risk data sheet, let me just get that pulled up here, we've got not just the response, but who's the responsible party? Who is it that's going to be taking this action to get it cleaned up? Who is it that's going to be doing the monitoring to see if the risk has occurred or if the probability has increased or decreased on it, because it changes over time. So we need to keep an eye on that, and that information all goes right in here. Do we have contingency funds and contingency time? Think of that as reserves. What's our reserve time, reserve budget in the event that this occurs? We go and we update this. And if we identified 100 risks, we have to go and update 100 of these sheets. Yep. It's a lot of work, right? So we got to get into that. We got to get that knocked out. It is a lot. And you'll see the other things listed here, budget and schedule activities, right? We got to account for that. Any of our fallback plans, our residual risks that might happen, right? What's an example of a residual risk? Well, if one employee gets sick and we fall behind schedule, one activity falling behind schedule could cause other activities to fall behind schedule. One employee getting sick could lead to other employees getting sick. You could have an epidemic, right? Yeah. Like in that Dustin Hoffman film. And before you know it, you're all wearing the yellow suits, right. And it's all going crazy.
Looking for monkeys. And
that's right. Yeah, once you bring the monkeys into it, then it's an absolute mess. So those are examples of like residual and secondary risks, right? Sometimes one risk is linked to another. If we have a hurricane, we may have floods. Yeah. We may have decreased sales. These are all things that might be risks. You might have risks that are completely out of left field, like your project's moving forward and a competitor moves in and opens up, or a competitor launches a similar product ahead of yours, right? All of a sudden the entire playing field changes. So we've got a plan for all of that, and it creates a lot of paperwork that comes out of our project. So definitely keep that in mind. This is the smallest of our processes, but it's deceptive because it's probably the most work.
Right.
But if you plan for this now, if you get your risk strategies in place now while you're in planning, when you get into execution, you can sleep easy. Because if a problem occurs, you've already thought about it, you've already planned for what you're going to do, and you act on it. Right. You don't have to do change tickets because you've already got the plan in place. You're just following the instructions you've already set forth. All right. So very good stuff. This is why risk managers are so valuable. Right. I hear people make fun of risk managers from time to time because if the risks never happen, what does a risk manager really do, right? But man, they're doing a very important service in your company, and they're basically making sure that you're insulated from the problems that could lead to your project failing. So very, very valuable. All right. Well, I think that pretty much wraps up risk. Ronnie,
Yep,
can you think
sure
of anything I've left out?
Nope, I cannot.
All right, well, we just have a little bit more to go in our planning processes. We'll see procurement management, which is our contracts, and our stakeholder management, which is attaching and removing people from the project. So we'll get to see a little bit of those, but we're pretty much ready to jump into execution there. So we'll have one more short episode for planning, and then we're going to jump into execution and really start to see some things take off. So definitely stay tuned for that. But otherwise, if you guys have any questions, let me just remind you, live during the show, you can go to itpro.tv/live. You'll see our chat box beneath the video. Post your questions there. We monitor and answer. We want to make sure you get the help that you need. Also, if you have questions after the show, if you're watching this recorded, use the Q&A forums. You'll see a link at the top of the page that says Q&A. Click on that. It'll take you into the forums. Post your questions there. We monitor and answer. We want to make sure that you get the help you need so that you're prepared for that exam and you're prepared for managing that project. All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I'm Don Pizzette.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
And we will see you next time.